Welcome to the Department Number 2 podcast. I am Derek Lindo, and I'm joined as usual with Daryl Smith, who graciously filled in for me last episode with Dave Mowry and talking about Cincinnati. So if you haven't learned, if you haven't listened to that episode yet, go back and listen to it because you will learn a lot about one of the most important cities in the United States during the Civil War. So, Daryl, how are you doing this great evening?
I am doing fantastic. Congrats again to your wife. I think I mentioned something on the last
Yeah,
episode, but it sounded like some good news
yeah.
without knowing all the details. But hey, it's all good, right? Congrats on
It's
that.
gonna be great for her or for us. Yeah, it's awesome.
Fantastic. Always good to hear. And other than that, hey, the health has been great. The work still is work, but it's a four-letter word for a reason, I guess. So, but beyond that, yeah, been doing very well, and we had a nice time with Dave Maurer the other night, and you could definitely tell he has done his statistical work because
Mm-hmm.
he had a lot of things going on, and
Yep.
it was the tip of the iceberg. So
Yeah.
we'll get him back on again to debate some John H. Morgan dude in the future. So
There's always some stuff there. Yeah. Yeah. When I was
always.
down in Nashville and Clarksville, I guess 2 weeks ago now, and there's a lot of talking about Morgan, and I was like, well, my opinion is he's a little overblown, but it's that's just my opinion. So
Yeah, it's a good opinion. I who can argue that? It's
yeah, exactly.
maybe too weak, a little overblown. I think it's
Yeah, so we could
ups and downs.
definitely talk a lot about Mr. Morgan there. But
Hmm.
tonight we're going to be talking about Mill Springs, talking about the battle, talking about the battlefield and the park now. So we are joined tonight with Andrew Miller. He works at Mill Springs, which has got to be a pretty awesome job. So, Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, guys, for having me. Appreciate it.
So, before we start getting into the meat here of all these questions that we have, like we were talking earlier before we hit record, this is probably not going to fit in one episode, but we'll see what we can get in. So, just first off, tell us a little about yourself. How'd you, how'd you come to Mill Springs up here in Kentucky?
Yeah, no. I guess there's a long answer, short answer. How do I get this so that this isn't the whole 1 hour? I think that the main thing is, like many of the listeners of the podcast, I had a passion for the American Civil War since I was a kid. I'm fortunate to have been born in the 80s and really was discovering what you're interested and passionate about at a really formative time when the Civil War was at its zenith. And Ken Burns had come out, and that was incredibly popular. You could get that at your local library, and Glory was available on VHS, and then obviously Gettysburg and et cetera, books, tons of books in the local libraries, the school libraries, things like that. And I just developed just this keen interest in American history in general and the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And by way of familiar connections with the American Civil War, my great-grandfather was still alive in the 90s. He knew his great-grandfather, who was a veteran of the Civil War. And as everybody's cutting their teeth and kind of finding their direction and what they're interested about the Civil War, you get involved with the Eastern Theater, you get involved with Gettysburg and Antietam and Manassas, and you look at all these battlefields, and there's definitely, you feel that it's neglected west of the Appalachian Mountain Range for sure, which is why this podcast exists, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, my great-grandfather would talk about his great-grandfather, which was Grandpa Google, not pronounced like the search engine, not spelled like it. He was a German immigrant that came over in the 1850s with his family through New York Harbor and settled in Indiana. And of course, when the Civil War came about, he did wait a year. He enlisted in August of '62 in the 73rd Indiana Infantry in Company G, and his brother and their brother-in-law went into Indianapolis and then down into Kentucky, where they arrived on the battlefield in Richmond. The brigade was in reserve. They didn't actually fight. They retreated back towards Louisville and were involved in the reorganization of the army there. They arrived on the Perryville battlefield, etc. But anyway, the short end of that is that my great-grandfather really heard all of these firsthand stories, most of which were probably pretty typical of what you heard from the World War II veterans of their time, the real-world experiences. We were hungry, we were tired, long shifts, long walking, riding mules, riding this. I mean, you never heard anything about a battle, and certainly my great grandfather never talked about it. I don't think that's what it was about. It was about, a German immigrant that came, served his country, started his family, moved up to around Cadillac, Michigan, settled and started the family. And that's really what the embodiment of that story was. And that put me on a trajectory of okay, who was this guy, and where did this regiment fight, and what are these places in Kentucky and Tennessee, Alabama, and that really blew up into this massive interest in the Western theater, and that from the late '90s till now, it's been really a focal point in my life, a passion which I was very fortunate enough to pursue as a career by way of several other odd jobs, like anything. But to get into the National Park Service, I was a preschool teacher in New Orleans, of all places, and I really wanted to work for the Park Service. I'd been trying to get seasonal positions out of college, could not land anything. It was incredibly difficult then, as it is now. And knowing that the 150th anniversary of the Civil War was coming up, I took a leap and contacted Stones River down in Murfreesboro, and was fortunate enough to get in touch with a ranger there, John McKay, who was their volunteer coordinator. And John is a Park Service legend, predominantly Mammoth Cave. Really, he's a legend for telling these really awesome, bombastic stories, which probably are half truths, but he's a great storyteller and a great interpreter. He gets a bar, listening. That's for sure. I've seen that on firsthand. But he took me on as a volunteer. I took this long break that I had as a teacher. I was able to go up to Stones River, live on the battlefield 40 hours a week, like it was a job, in a uniform. And I mean, from day one, you're on a Civil War battlefield. Grandpa Google and the 73rd Indiana were one of the first regiments to cross Stones River to reconnoiter where the Confederates were located during that battle. So Dan Masters, I'm sure, is listening, but so to be able to just stand there, and I remember asking the Rangers, hey, on the morning of the 29th, is it cool if I just go down to Stones River and stand there? And they were like, yeah, it's totally fine. It's not even, I didn't know it wasn't part of the battlefield, but stand there and think about what my great grandfather had talked about as a kid. Yeah. And it's humbling. It's very humbling to stand in those locations with those personal connections. And I think that at that point, I knew that's what I wanted to do as a career. And the next year, through a letter of recommendation from another mentor there, Jim Lewis, who's a Park Service icon at Stones River. And he's been a mentor for years, and he's just an all-around great guy. I was able to get my first seasonal job in New York City and bounced from New York City to Shiloh, to Fort Pulaski in Savannah, to the Statue of Liberty, to Vicksburg, where I spent over 5 years living there and working on the battlefield. I worked at Andersonville, Valley Forge. So I've been very fortunate and blessed in my career to work at some of the most iconic National Park Service sites, and took a chance. And fortunately, the battlefield at Mill Springs, we'll talk more about it, but it was picked up by the National Park Service as a national park in 2020, in September 2020. And eventually they were able to hire their first interpretive manager or chief of interpretation. And again, fortunate enough to become the first chief of interpretation at Mill Springs Battlefield National Monument. So been all over the country, seen a lot of things, made a lot of friends, hopefully not a lot of enemies. But it's been a wild ride for sure. And somehow, some way, as a kid, thinking, living in Hudson Valley in New York, where I grew up, I would never probably have imagined ever working at any one of those places, and let alone being able to take this new national park site, this Civil War battlefield, and put it on the right footing for future generations to enjoy. So it's humbling, but it's an honor for sure.
Yeah, I mean, in a way too, that's a dream for for a lot of kids growing up that are into the Civil War. It's like you get to work, where it all happened. I mean, it's really cool.
Right.
Really cool.
For sure. Yeah, everybody wants to work at Gettysburg till you go to Gettysburg. And you're like, woo, this is like the Six Flags Disney World of Civil War.
Yeah.
And I have great friends that work there, and they love it. But to me, my heart has always been in the Western theater, and that's where I wanted my career to be. And I'm not saying, hey, let's just not burn any bridges. Gettysburg, if you come calling, I suppose, may take
Yeah,
some convincing. But that being said, these parks out west need passionate and great rangers, and you go to each one of them and you meet these rangers, and you're like, oh my god, these people are as interested as I am, and they have so much information to convey. And I know both
yeah,
of you have gone up and down to every one of these sites and met all these different rangers, and they're all great and
they
lots
are.
of
Yeah,
information.
for sure, for sure. All right, so Daryl, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, I'm going to reword this a little bit because I realized what I wrote was a little awkward. So, what things have been going on at Mill Springs now that it's a national park unit, and then what can we expect on the horizon? Because you got a guy up the road at another national monument. I think it got named the same day as Mill Springs. Who's been just a guy must just have a coffee IV. Steve Fonz, of course, who I'm talking about. So,
Yeah.
but what kind of things? What's been going on at Mill Springs, and what kind of plans, if you can share, whatever you can share, what's coming on up for us? What can we expect if we show up there 2 years from now, or something along those lines?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and Steve, the Camp Nelson actually was created 2 years before Mill Springs was, so
Yeah.
they have a 2 year head start on
Okay.
funding and growth, and so you're starting to see them really make their strides, and they're doing an excellent job up there. The things that they're producing and the things that Steve has accomplished up there, and his entire staff. I mean, Ernie, the superintendent, is phenomenal. Everybody there is great, and they are 100% doing that place justice, and so kudos to them. I mean, it's great, and we're again happy to partner with them constantly and try to figure out. I mean, Steve and I were literally just talking the other day about coordinating different types of events that bring our parks together. We're only an hour away, so we not only share the commonality of our themes and the Civil War and the things that are going on in Kentucky, but just as a resource together. And I've known Steve for a very long time, even before he was in the National Park Service. So it's great to have a resource like Steve, energetic coworker up there that wants to do good work. We've certainly seen the opposite of that. So it's just a great thing to that. First and foremost, we're growing. We're brand new. We have just acquired our staff over the past couple of years. In fact, I'm probably one of the newest people on staff right now, as we're kind of cutting our teeth, and it's taking time and effort for us to get into our community and use our community and the park staff, regional staff, staff in the Washington office to enable this park to grow into what it's going to become. So I guess first and foremost, making sure that people understand that this stuff doesn't happen overnight. I know that I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Mill Springs Battlefield Association, and that is the non-for-profit association that was started by the local community and really spearheaded by Bill Nykirk. And the things that they did from 1992, taking grants from the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program, large donations, acquiring large tracts of the battlefield to preserve it. Without them, there is no National Park Service taking it over. And really, they did get to the point where their capacity was maxed out, and they wanted to see all of their hard work and effort and preservational efforts not gone to vain, watch it go away because they run out of money or some other reason. And so they wanted actively and sought out to get this park to become a national park. And they did a great job. Here we are. So without them, again, there is no Mill Springs Battlefield National Monument. But the park staff management team, we're being very strategic in what we're doing. We're steadily working on major updates to the park, museum rehabilitation, the museum the association created. We're now putting together a full rehabilitation to get accessible exhibits, interactive exhibits, a variety of things involved with that. It's going to take a couple of years, and we just got a cost estimates of just under $1 million. So that's exciting. The association thankfully created the infrastructure that we inherited. So unlike having to create something out of thin air, hey, we need to build the building first. Nope, it's all there. So we actually, because of them, can make a much bigger and quicker impact by looking at our museum and talking to our community and our park partners to make sure that we're putting together really strong and diverse museum exhibits for understanding the context of the Civil War. So for you and your listeners, obviously watch the National Park Service's website for Mill Springs, watch the social media. I mean, there will be tons of opportunity to make public comments on the things that we're doing. So this is not just, the National Park Service, forging ahead. It really takes a village to make this stuff happen. And it takes your listeners, people who are passionate, that want to see this stuff happen. And we take all of these comments as we make our planning documents and put it forward. So I want to emphasize that too. That's incredibly important. And you can do that at any national park site, not just ours because we're new. If Chickamauga is doing something, go on their website and see what they're doing. Go to Gettysburg, go to Vicksburg, go to any one of them, and you'll see that you can actually have a voice in what the park management is considering when making their plans. We're looking at a National Park Service film and an orientation film. We want, that's a top priority for us right now, is making sure that we put together a brand new film. We have some rangers that have discovered some really amazing primary resources that have never been seen, even by Bill and the association. We found a brand new map that was done directly after the battle by Kinsman Hutton, who was a lieutenant colonel of the 1st Michigan Engineers and Mechanics, which we're familiar with, obviously in early Civil War Kentucky, and they continue to progress with the Army of the Ohio, Army of the Cumberland throughout the war. But his part of the battalion is here on the battlefield, and he's ordered to do a full map of the battlefield. And because he does that, we have probably one of the most accurate battlefield maps. I would put it up with the Pepsi Challenge on anybody else's map. I mean, he did it by chains, which we can convert to feet and miles of where every single fence was located on the battlefield, every single tree line, you name it, every identifiable cabin on the battlefield was listed, you name it. And not only is this map like, wow, what an awesome planning document to return the battlefield to the way it was in its January 1862 state, but even more exciting, read the primary sources, read the official reports of the officers, look at what the soldiers were writing, and then look at this map and recognize that the battlefield today that you visit looks nothing like it did. So when you're talking about where they're running through, you're like, where are the woods? I know the ravines there. I can see it. Where are all the woods? Where's the fence lines? What was the issue here? I don't understand why they didn't just come up and over the hill and knock the Federals out and continue on, to Fishing Creek. And we'll talk more about the campaign and battle. But this document very clearly outlines some of the major logistical issues and some of the not only geographical but physical barriers that the soldiers had to fight over and around. Without that, who knows? We'd be using these old, plates from the official records, trying to figure out what was going on here when portions of those maps are missing vital information. So things like that we're then able to put together some new projects, one of which is a historic fencing project. Return the fencing so that you can actually stand on the battlefield and understand where the fighting was taking place. We want to create, this is called asset creation. We want to create hiking trails so people can that come to this park that may not be interested in military history can still enjoy it. And so we're looking at a variety of different ways for engaging everybody that wants to come to this place that's just outside of Lake Cumberland, receives 3 to 4 million visitors a year, come to the park, recreate, enjoy, and maybe read a wayside and learn a little bit of the history too. Awesome. Win-win. If we're making you connect with the land and you're interested in that, you're going to want to preserve it as much as somebody like us who wants to preserve it for the history side. So that's awesome. So we're working on things like that. We've just opened our Eastern National Bookstore just opened. So wink, wink, nudge, nudge. There's a particular book on the shelves that a particular person on this podcast may or may not have written. We may have to get Daryl's book on that. I just saw him post on.
That's a little booklet. That's not a book.
No, that's okay. Those things are important to understanding the context of what's happening in this region. So, but the store's a big deal. It not that I would say it legitimizes the park, but people want to come on vacation. They want to see park-related objects, shirts, mugs, things like that, and take something home to really remember your visit there, beyond just the National Park Service stamp that you could get. And so opening that store invites people to purchase things to learn more about the battle and take them home, which is really awesome. And it's just going to grow from there. Really what people want to see when they come here, interpretive programming, ranger talks, ranger walks, battle hikes. We are initiating our historic weapons program, so black powder, musket, and artillery demonstrations. Our special events, we're looking at our fall. We usually do a Civil War weekend called Conflict at the Crossroads. We're trying to pull people into the idea that even though this is Mill Springs is 10 miles down the road, this is actually called Logan's Crossroads, and this is where the battle's taking place. I'd rather you call it Fishing Creek. We're closer to Fishing Creek than we are to Mill Springs. But I didn't get my input when the Congress put it in on the bill. Things like that. I mean, it's just setting and standing this park up. And this is the very beginning. So the things that we're doing now, making our local community partnerships, doing our outreach events, and standing up our operation is where we're at right now, so that we can get to a place where Camp Nelson is, or Abraham Lincoln birthplace, or even Mammoth Cave, an hour and change west of here. We want to get to that point where people are coming here and expecting the services that they should be receiving. And so that's kind of where we're at. It's exciting. It's a lot. We're tired a lot. We're frustrated a lot. We cut the red tape as much as we can. But the bottom line is it's exciting to be a part of starting not only a new national park site, but a Civil War site, which is incredibly rare.
Yeah.
Really cool stuff.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Derek and I are just nodding our heads and we're salivating a little bit here.
Yes.
Without really knowing you, Andrew, it sounds like the place might be in some good hands here.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. The guy up the road might have a little challenge here.
Yeah.
He's got that 2-year head.
Steve's always been worried. Steve knows that I'm not going to say it's a threat. I've just known Steve a long time. And I think that, Steve and I talk more about football. He's a Broncos fan, I'm a Jets fan.
Yeah.
We commiserate. It's much easier to commiserate, than anything else.
Yeah, wrong color orange.
Right,
That's
right,
just the wrong color orange.
Yeah. No, exactly. And again, not to. But Steve's a great guy. He's going to end up listening to this and be like, "Oh man, Andrew hates me."
Yeah.
Nope. Yeah. Not the case. Not the case, Steve.
And we haven't had him on yet, so he's got retribution. So there's that piece. So
if I could share, I wish this was on my computer, because if I could share my screen, the museum when the association did it, they actually had a mannequin of Zollikofer dead against the Zolli tree in the museum, and when the Park Service took it, they were like, "Okay, we're not going to." Put dead body, even though there technically is another exhibit that we're reconsidering. But anyway, Steve took a picture of Zollikofer, and he uses it to make fun of the park sometimes. And so, because this is classic Steve fan. And so what he does now, whenever he sends me something about one of his programs, I just send him the same email back. Basically, this is one of your visitors falling asleep as you've talked for 2 hours about nothing. And it's just this guy's against the tree. So it's become tit for tat, man. He dishes it, he takes it. It's all good. Yeah.
Well, when Zolli hits the fan, there we go.
100%.
Zolli hits the fan.
Very much. Exactly.
Well, you kind of alluded. I'm going to jump in there, Derek, because I think the next two are kind of mine too. You talked about Mill Springs, right? So obviously, it's 10 miles as the crow flies.
Right.
You're not flying there to get there. So you've got some challenges, unique challenges for a national park, I think, in most cases. You've got part of your unit on the other side of a lake. And then, of course, part of that unit also has the West Metcalf House. So how are you going to try to deal with getting visitors down to that area? And then will the West Metcalf House be open for visitation sometime in the future?
Yeah. There's no doubt that the discontiguous factor of the park, that it's located not only on two sides of what is Lake Cumberland today, at the time of the war, the Cumberland River. I think that what you really, I'm not going to say what we're going to do, but in my mind, you sort of have to make it thematic and get people to understand the uniqueness of the resources on both sides of the lake. So, there's the core battlefield. Of course, the park was created because of January 19th, 1862, and the events that took place on those morning hours that impacted our nation's history, right? But down the road, 9 miles is Beech Grove, the Confederate winter encampment, and that
Mhm.
enables us to talk about the uniqueness of that location. What is a winter encampment, and why do armies do that? And it harkens back to Valley Forge and Washington's army and the birth of this great nation. And we're kind of looking at how do you make that relatable to the public, and then you go on the other side of the lake, and not only is there the West Metcalf House, or at the time it was the West House, but then you have the Brown Lanier home as well, and we're closer to acquiring the Brown Lanier home than we are the West Metcalf House, and the Brown Lanier home um, was really in its several iterations as it was built upon and updated throughout its existence from the 1830s into the 1860s, or 1860, I think it was the last modification. The home was the Miller's home for Mill Springs. The Miller lived there, and originally we think of the Metcalfs were the original Millers of the original mill. And as time grew on, eventually by the time of the American Civil War, Thompson Brown and his family were living in this home. And Thompson Brown was a reputed pro-Confederate, pro-secessionist, one of the only ones in the area. Most of the people in Monticello were considered to be Unionist for the most part. And so when the Confederates eventually fortified that area, there's some conjecture on what was the house used for. Zollicoffer wasn't even in that area long enough to potentially use the house, although that gray area of who would have been in there, of course, we assume that he was.
Mm-hmm.
What we do know, though, is eventually it becomes George Crittenden's headquarters when he arrives, and he is in the home. And this is something that the park is working on, because it's putting together its historic structure report for that home. And we have a historian that is putting together that work to get us to understand the history of the home and its importance, and all history, including the area and what's going on there, but how it was used during the campaign and battle.
Cool.
As far as the West Metcalf House, I think that we don't really have a foothold on that yet. We're making inroads into the communities down in Wayne County. We're really looking to work with them, but we see the importance of the West Metcalf House, no doubt. I mean, we could look at it and it's like it's incredibly important. There's so much primary information that talks about that home. Union prisoners of war are sent there. It is a field hospital. But Captain West that lived in the house was a Unionist, but he's not really aiding Confederates, but he's like opening his doors. I don't know if he had much choice. I mean, 8,000 men show up. They're like, hey, we're here. And he's like, all right, no problem. Camp out. Do whatever you want to do, I suppose.
You're going to be a good host.
Yeah, and he was. I mean, he. There's nothing bad ever said about that guy by Union or Confederate soldiers. So he must have been a pretty cool dude. But we understand the importance of it for the Battle of Mill Springs, and at this point, we're only in the preliminary stages of discussing the acquisition of that particular historic home. But I would assume in time down the road, those are the two homes, and that location really discusses what was life like in this region. What were people doing on the south side of the river? What were they doing on the north side of the river? How were people living in this area? Because it was incredibly rural. And there's, these families are, everybody's a Burton, everybody's a Hudson. They still are in the area. So they are all descendants of the people that were living there at the time of the battle and before. So we actively want to seek out those stories and understand what was this place like, and go even beyond. What was the indigenous stories here? We're really trying to understand the land that we are now stewards of, and what was happening here to tell these stories. So I would say for the West Metcalf House, stay tuned. I think that within the next decade, there's going to be some pretty cool things happening on both sides of the lake.
Good. Yeah, it's good to hear.
For sure.
Good to hear.
Yeah.
Sounds like the park's really looking at the uniqueness of the individual sites to address those as individual entities within the collective.
For sure.
So,
yeah, for
awesome.
Sure. Yep.
It's we said earlier, with Camp Nelson being an hour away, this whole area of Kentucky is, none of these sites are really that far away from each other.
No.
mean, Richmond's not very far from you guys, is it either? Right?
Hour
and a
I
half.
think
Hour and a
no,
half,
no. 50 minutes.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
45,
right.
50 minutes. Yeah. I mean, it takes you that long to get to Buc-ee's, and it's right by Buc-ee's. So Buc-ee's did not pay for any of this. They're not sponsoring this
We'll edit that
podcast.
out.
Yeah, we'll edit this one out.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I again, the thing that we're always talking about, and what I talk about with Jim Lewis at Stones River, or any of the Rangers, Lee White at Chickamauga, you name it, we really talk about how sometimes the parks feel like they're on an island.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no Civil War battlefield that's a vacuum. I mean, we're all connected. Whether we're all in Kentucky or it's the campaigns that lead to the ultimate victory. I mean, we constantly talk about Mill Springs. Mill Springs, we're the first domino at the beginning of the dominoes that fall to get us to the end of the Civil War. We are the first decisive Union victory, and I don't care what is said about the two forts on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. We're overshrouded in history because of those events that take place west of here. But we're all connected, and I think it would be silly for us to debate or thump our chest and pretend that we're more important than this place or our story is more relevant than. We're all connected. And without Mill Springs, there's no fort. There's no collapse of the eastern flank. So, the resources that could have been sent to Fort Henry and Donaldson never happened, and the Confederates retreat, and then there's Shiloh, and there's it all is relative. And without Mill Springs, there's no Camp Nelson. The solidification of Unionist sentiment in the state is solidified by this battle. We could debate all day to the rooster crows that what is more important, but it's just all related. And I don't think anybody we all agree. So I think we like to poke fun at each other, especially internally in the National Park Service, about this little skirmish up here in Kentucky versus this big battle over here. Whatever. You're like, okay, it's fine. Or Gettysburg used to do it when I worked at Vicksburg for 5 years, and people are like, where are you guys out there in Mississippi? You're like, oh, okay. Sounds pretty good for two armies colliding in Pennsylvania and nothing coming about it. Whereas the Mississippi River severs the Confederacy in twain, captures a full Confederate army, chases the other one out of anyway. So
he's proselytizing folks.
I'm going to take that sound clip and make it the intro to every single podcast.
Yeah, I think so.
That's okay. That's okay. I mean, we'll when this is all done, we'll do quick one-liners just to get everybody fired up about the Western Theater. I can certainly do that. We have good quotes up here. I got Thomas's quote. Well, it's apocryphal, but I got the quote Thomas says to Manson here, and it's a pretty good one. And you can use that for the beginning of your podcast too. So,
yeah, I think that'd be great.
We like it.
Yep.
So I guess now we'll go ahead and start talking about the campaign and the battle.
Sure.
So really, I mean, we could spend a lot of time on this.
Yeah.
But it's what I told Joseph Rickey, I guess, a few weeks ago when we were talking about Franklin. Give us the 30,000 foot view about how we get here at Logan's Crossroads and Fishing Creek, and because it's not. It doesn't seem like it's not a perfect line from both sides. Like there's a lot of shuffling going on, and so how do we get there, and who's involved on both sides?
Yeah. Geez. The only thing I can harken back is I had to do a podcast about Vicksburg, and I didn't realize I talked for 2.5 hours, and they were fine with it. I was like, hell, we didn't even get to the siege yet. He just kept asking questions. I was like, I guess we're going to get there. The easiest way to say it is that for those listeners that aren't as familiar with Kentucky or what's happening is when the shots at Fort Sumter, when the federal garrison there is fired upon, respectively, President Abraham Lincoln is going to ask for volunteers from every loyal state in the Union, for which the governor of Kentucky, Beriah McGoffin, adamantly refuses only 2 days later. He's basically, without saying an expletive, F you, but in a much nicer way, he is saying, I will not, be sending any volunteer soldiers to suppress any of our sister southern states. So you pretty much know where he stands um, with where he wants to see the Commonwealth go. Um, and the long and the short of it is that the legislature in Frankfurt eventually it becomes heavily unionist and conciliatory, and they decide to develop a policy called armed neutrality. And basically, we're not going to get involved in some fratricidal civil war. We're just going to um, stay out of it. I mean, effectively, you come in our state and we're going to fight you. You come across the Ohio, we're going to fight you. You come across the Cumberland and you enter the state from Tennessee or Virginia or wherever, we're going to fight you. It's not going to be good. And so that seems to be the conciliatory policy that people think is going to avert them from entering the war, which is ludicrous. Almost overnight. I mean, you have Magoffin has the state guard under Simon Bolivar Buckner, and they are very much pro-secessionist, and he's got several thousand men organized in central western Kentucky, and they are just primed to do something. And of course, you have the naval lieutenants, Sam Carter and William Bull Nelson, and their objective is to establish training facilities for home guard units, Kentuckians, and refugees from East Tennessee to form units to defend the state for the Union, right? And so you already have this stuff organically happening in the state. Just south of Kentucky is Tennessee. They're sister states. They came into the Union roughly at the same time period. There is no real border, even though there is, and family lines are blurred. So while the state of Kentucky declares its neutrality, the people of Tennessee are really trying to figure out where they're going to go. And oddly enough, people are like, well, oh yeah, Tennessee was a southern state. It seceded. Yeah, it did. But in February of 1961, the governor, Isham Harris, really believed that the state would go then. All these states are seceding from the Union. He's like, hell yeah, we're going to go too, brother. Hulk and his Hulk Hogan. But what happens is it doesn't work out. I mean, the majority of the people from West Central and Eastern Tennessee really are pro-Union, and the pro-secessionists are the minority, and they're kind of reeling and push back on their heels, and it takes them till June, and really it's the firing on Fort Sumter, and it's the propaganda. Not to get into that whole thing, but the secessionists in Tennessee were damn good at really getting the people who were pro-constitutionalists to recognize, look at what this president is doing, sending troops, requesting troops, sending them into the southern states. He's going to do this to us. Don't you see it? Open your eyes. And the people are like, what? And they are like, we can't have that. And it's almost a complete 180, where by June, the vast majority of, May into June, the people flip overnight, and the state of Tennessee goes out of the Union on June 8th, and that's it. And while the state secedes and Harris gets what he wants, and they start to prepare themselves, arming themselves, organizing the regiments in Tennessee that are going to defend the state, the people of Eastern Tennessee openly defy Harris and say, absolutely not. This is unconstitutional. You cannot do this. We adamantly refute secession, and we are for the Union. And so now you got this weird dichotomy going on in the state. And what are people doing? And so that's where we get into the Mill Springs stuff. In Nashville, there is a very influential former congressman, former newspaperman, Felix Kirk Zollicoffer, who was commissioned as a brigadier general. And in the end of July, he is sent to Eastern Tennessee to, I wish I could quote, but I think it's to protect property, defend the railroads, and basically keep the peace, which, and defend the state from invasion. And it's ironic because he goes to East Tennessee to declare that martial law is declared, and they're suppressing the media and anybody that's pro-union. They're making lists, and this caused a mass exodus of all these young and old men to abandon their families to go through Cumberland Gap into Kentucky to seek refuge because they think they're either going to be conscripted into the Tennessee forces or, imprisoned or killed.
Right.
And so it's a pretty insane scene going on in Eastern Tennessee at this time period. Very sad. Depredations immediately start happening. And it's just a pretty bad place to be.
And it's interesting that Zollicoffer, previous to the war, he was a Whig, wasn't he?
Oh, no doubt. He was a hardcore Whig,
Yeah.
and he was one of those February guys. We can't possibly leave the Union. I mean, there's nobody in the state of Tennessee that does a bigger 180 than Felix Zollicoffer. There's time, you understand because he is a Tennessean and he, the state decides and the people decide, and what's more democratic than that? The people have decided, I am going to go with my state. We must defend Tennessee. But for him to just is pretty crazy considering where he was trying to keep the state out of the war and avert it, and his loyalty to the Constitution of the United States, and he like many people throughout the South and especially the Upper South, they are not falling in line with the fire-eating hardcore secessionists that want to go. These people are really at a crossroads, and we are only one or two generations away from the revolutionaries that founded the nation. Their fathers and grandfathers. So we look at this point in history, and it's like, think about our fathers and grandfathers that fought in the Second World War, and the things that they did, and it's like, we hear the stories that they told us that it wasn't even an option. We were just going. It's like that's that's many of the stories of the revolutionaries are like there was no choice. We had to fight to create this nation, and only 80 years later, it's the country's tearing itself apart. So it's everybody is truly at a crossroads. So it's August 1861. We get into September, and Zollicoffer is defending Eastern Tennessee. He's preparing his soldiers. They are organizing in that part of the state around Knoxville. As we're aware, or maybe we're not aware, September is a pretty important month for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Confederates had been preparing defenses along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers at Fort Hyman, Henry, and Donelson, and in the western part of the state. And again, it's part of that stagnant defense that the Confederacy or the state of Tennessee and the Confederate government are preparing. But what starts to take place? Well, a large buildup of federal forces in the state of Illinois prepared for some sort of invasion. The fear is that they're going to get possession of the high eminence in Columbus, Kentucky on the Mississippi River, and that can't happen. Gideon Pillow, under the authority of Leonidas Polk, marches Confederate troops into the state, nullifies the armed neutrality of the Commonwealth. And of course, the legislature in Frankfort, which was looking for a reason, uses that obviously as hey, this is a declaration of war. You've marched hostile troops into our Commonwealth, and we are now going to be going with Lincoln and the U.S. government pretty much like we wanted to. Only a couple days later, Brigadier General U.S. Grant marches into Paducah, and that whole side of the state starts to get established in what's going to be happening in this state. I don't know if Zollicoffer, it's hard to tell if he really knew what was going to be happening or not. But on September 19th is when the state declares its loyalty to the Union. On the night of September 19th, Zollicoffer marches his men through Cumberland Gap into the Commonwealth. I mean, it's like either that is the perfect timing, and he's just like, screw it, I'm going. And he goes through the gap, and they're like, oh, perfect timing. They've declared against the Union. Good, we're here. But the long and short of that is he comes here not as an invader, but a liberator. And he actually puts together, being a newspaper man, he understood the influence of the press, and he puts out an address basically saying that we are here to liberate the loyal citizens of Kentucky. We are not here to steal your crops and your chickens and rob you of your things. We're here to defend you against the invading Yankees who are going to come into the state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The hope was, much like in 1862, that loyal Men in Kentucky and Tennessee will flock to the banners of the Southern cause, swell the armies, and enable Zollicoffer as an independent commander to prosecute some sort of campaign in the state. It does not really happen. However, Zollicoffer will start to march his men through the Commonwealth, fighting at Barbersville and eventually tangling with a Union force at Camp Wildcat or Wildcat Mountain near present-day London, Kentucky, in October of 1861. Doesn't go too well for Zollicoffer at Wildcat. It's not necessarily his total fault. He had a pretty overwhelming force. The federal force there is incredibly small, but it's the terrain, and if anybody's ever been there and seen, it's brutal. Yeah, I mean, everybody wants to think about Little Round Top and how hard it was for the Texans and Alabamians to conquer that hill, and it is a mighty eminence. I mean, look at the terrain that they're fighting around here. It's nothing, Little Round Top is nothing compared to Wildcat Mountain and what they were trying to do to overcome the geographical features of that battlefield. So Zollicoffer takes it on the chin. He goes back through the gap, and this is where we kind of get into the Mill Springs campaign. He's looking for another location to bring his army, and he looks at a map. It's pretty easy to see that Mill Springs is the first major bend on the Cumberland River that has a good source of water. First and foremost, an army needs a good source of water for a large-scale encampment. You cannot have an army without viable drinking water, and there are several there. There is a mill, hence the name Mill Springs, that could produce corn and flour and a variety of things that the mill could provide the army there, good sustenance for bread and etc. There's a decent amount of crops in the area. But first and most importantly, it is on the Cumberland River and a direct line to Nashville. And Nashville will supply Zollicoffer's forces with literally anything it needs. Not only that, but a large portion of Zollicoffer's forces, the majority of his force that he brings to Mill Springs are Tennesseans. There is one regiment with him from Mississippi, the 15th Mississippi, from the northern part of that state. But the majority of the men he has with him are Tennesseans, and many of them are from the Nashville or central Tennessee area, middle Tennessee area. And so Nashville's home. Nashville is a direct link to sending letters home and getting word of family and news and newspapers and anything they can really want. And so Zollicoffer looks at that area as a prime location for his army to go. And so that's where he is going to go. In the end of November, beginning of December, 1861. Conversely, on the other side, you have the Union authorities, and November is a pretty big month for the Union authorities in the Commonwealth. You went through a couple iterations of department commanders. You had the hero Fort Sumter, Robert Anderson. Very short-lived, a very stressful position for him, and so he is there to establish it with his headquarters in Cincinnati, right? So he's understanding the political ramifications of establishing anything unionist in the Commonwealth, and so he doesn't even do that. I don't think. I think it's not until he decides to resign and remove himself, and the second in command, William Tecumseh Sherman, becomes the department commander, and we all know, or if we're not familiar with that, he becomes incredibly stressed out himself. Struggles is a nice way of saying it. The press in Cincinnati would call him crazy, insane. But for our listeners that understand how the war was progressed, he calls for 200,000 soldiers to put down this rebellion. And ladies and gentlemen, the Union Army has 2 million soldiers in its ranks by the end of the war to put the rebellion down. So dropping the bucket to what he was calling for. But he is very nervous. He's becoming, his nerves are getting the better of him. He's smoking. He's not sleeping. And anybody has ever seen anybody go through some panic attacks and things like that, he's just in a bad place. So the War Department disposes of him, and they get Brigadier General Don Carlos Buell. Buell was a West Point graduate, like Sherman and Anderson. But there's good ththings about Buell. There are many bad things that have been said about Buell, but there's good things about Buell. And Buell is a McClellanite, whereas he is cut from the old regular army. He is a organizer, and he wants to put the forces in the Commonwealth into some shape to pursue a campaign, obviously. And he's much like McClellan, where he's going to take his time too. But
Yep.
I think if we could say good things about Don Carlos Buell, it's that he sees this rabble of Union soldiers, this, again, discontinuously located camps of instruction in the state and different locations, and he actually organizes it into some semblance of an army. And so for that, Buell is okay in my book for establishing that. However, that being said, as he starts to do that, his idea of how he puts the army together is a little unusual, where he does he puts the army together in divisions and brigades, and actually it's not that organization that's unusual, but it's how he organizes the brigades into basically individual units. If we look at Civil War armies that they're organizing in the North, they're usually organized by regiment, then brigade, then division, and then Army Corps eventually. Buell doesn't do anything like that. And in each division in the Army is usually the 1st Brigade, 2nd Brigade, 3rd Brigade of 1st Division, 2nd Division, 1st Brigade, 2nd Brigade, 3rd Brigade. I mean, it's pretty well cut and dry and established. And Buell doesn't do that. He just does, 1 through, I'm trying to think how many brigades he has at the time period. It's like 1 through 22. So the 1st Brigade through the 22nd Brigade, and then he assigns them to different divisions. And he doesn't even give the 1st Division the first 5 brigades to make it easy. He's like, okay, you're going to get the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 12th Brigade. And it's like, hell, well, that's confusing. And then he makes them, because they're independent at his disposal, it's almost like the division commanders are only second in command, and they have no real authority because Buell can pluck them out and put them where he wants them. So Buell was really trying to keep his hands, and we've all had a boss like that that micromanages, and that seems to be kind of how Buell wants to do it. But long story short, he's organizing the Union Army of the Ohio in the area, and Zollicoffer is progressing this campaign in South Central and Eastern Kentucky, and Buell doesn't really care, to be completely honest. Zollicoffer's a thorn in his side, but he's not doing much other than denying any federal campaign to move into Eastern Tennessee. And I guess I should have mentioned probably earlier on that since the beginning of the war, with the Confederate authorities in Eastern Tennessee initiating martial law, it is a high priority of the Lincoln administration in Washington City that a large federal force, maybe the entire army, marches down the Wilderness Road into Eastern Tennessee, relieves the beleaguered Unionist citizens there, crushes the rebellion, and occupies that area. And that is something that they're going to emphasize from the summer of 1861 throughout, really, into 1862, before the victory of Mill Springs, the falls of Fort Henry and Donelson, and how the campaign progresses into the actual state through Nashville. Lincoln wants something done about Eastern Tennessee, and the congressmen, Henry Maynard especially, they are pushing on Lincoln, hey, get your boys to do something. This is ridiculous. Our people are suffering. So that is going to be constantly a bug in Buell's ear as he's trying to organize his army, and as he's trying to really progress the campaign that he wants, which is not sending his army into the desolate region of Eastern Kentucky and Eastern Tennessee, but sending his army down the main roads and rail lines towards Bowling Green, destroy or push the Confederates out of that area and take Nashville. He wants Nashville. Yeah. He sees that as a logistical place where he could use the rivers to get to Eastern Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, or even progress throughout the state of Tennessee and take it that way. So Buell's idea of how he wants to conduct his campaign is fundamentally different than the administration is. And so for what you see, while Zollicoffer is really doing his thing, you have Buell just organizing. Now, at the beginning of December 1861, Zollicoffer has fortified the Mill Springs area, and he decides that what he wants to do is cross the Cumberland River. It's at a very low point. It's only about 130 yards across. He wants to cross his main forest and fortify the location on the north side of a peninsula called Beech Grove. And he thinks that by doing that and establishing his force on both sides, one, he creates a much larger encampment for his soldiers to actually build winter quarters, but he thinks he really dominates the river and the control of it. And so he's got this pinch point on the Cumberland River where he controls everything. And the any federal military traffic would be stopped by his forces. And
So
yeah,
it seems like crossing the Cumberland, that'd be a big deal. And so Zollicoffer, he doesn't really ask for permission. He just does it, right? He's talking to Johnston.
Yeah. So yes, I mean Zollicoffer does ask for permission. He does send a missive to Johnston after he's crossed. So you're right. You are right.
Yeah.
Basically, what we see is that Zollicoffer he'd been an independent commander. He had been taking his force and doing whatever he wanted to do up to this point. And when he gets to Mill Springs and he decides that he's going to cross the river, he crosses. He sends his intelligence to General Albert Sidney Johnston in command of Department Number 2, or the Western Department, and Johnston's in Bowling Green, and he sends this stuff to him. He's already crossed a sizable force, large battalions of cavalry and several infantry regiments, and he receives a note back from Johnston telling him not to do it. He says, "Don't do it. That's you never cross a river. You never divide your forces. You never put your backs to a river without a means of escaping. Just don't do it." And so, of course, Zollicoffer will send something back saying, to some, and I'm guess paraphrasing, but I'm under the impression that you are dissatisfied with my course of action, and I will immediately remove my forces, et cetera. And he doesn't. He continues to cross his forces across the river. In fact, his main force is now going to be across the Cumberland River on the north side of Beech Grove. They are fortifying that position. They have a Confederate engineer, Victor von Scheele, who was a Prussian-born engineering officer, and he is the one constructing the fortifications. He becomes more famous down the road when he does the fortifications in Mobile, and he's involved with the construction down there. Confederates, they spend their time in December 1861 helping freedmen and enslaved African Americans dig the entrenchments, and they also are building their winter huts or winter quarters as they were establishing. The weather is getting pretty cold. We have a particular officer, Moscow Carter of the famous Carter family from Franklin, Williamson County. And Moscow Carter's there with his brother Todd. Todd is here and there, but what Moscow talks about is he really leaves us with a good idea of how cold or hot it was. I mean, he's recording that in his diary, and it's very interesting information for us to understand how cold it was getting, and these soldiers were spending their time. So you have the Confederate forces divided. They've crossed to the north side of the Cumberland River, and that gets that really starts to get the attention of Buell. He still considers Zollicoffer an annoyance, and that's about it. He's not really preoccupied with him, but Zollicoffer starts to send out forage expeditions and things, and the populace is becoming concerned. The military authorities Buell orders Thomas to send Alvin Schaff's down to Somerset, and he brings a couple regiments, and they start to send more troops down to Somerset because there's no sizable force there to contest Zollicoffer. In fact, when Zollicoffer is considering crossing the river, a company under Boston Dillon of the 1st Kentucky U.S. Cavalry is sent to present-day Nancy to observe and try to thwart a crossing. And I mean, as you can possibly imagine, he fails. He doesn't even make it to the crossing point. I think he establishes a camp at present-day Nancy, about where the visitor center is, or around that location, just down Kentucky 235, which was the Mill Springs Road at the time. And they send a couple guys down the road only to find out that they're getting ready to cross. And that was pretty much it. He's like, well, I'm not going to take on these guys. They're crossing, and they're going to whoop me, so I'm going to head back and just tell everyone that they're crossed already. So it's one of these early war ludicrous situations where would that have stopped Zollicoffer? Maybe, maybe not, but
It would have made him think.
Right. Zollicoffer would have seen a sizable force on everybody at this time period of the war seems to struggle with how big of a force am I truly opposing, and a company on a ridge firing. And by the way, the 1st Kentucky has Sharp's rifles, repeating rifles. And so even a company on the eminence looking over the ferry crossing, firing rapidly, probably would have been like, hey, they may have a regiment or larger on that side of the north side of the Cumberland. I don't know if we want to go over there, but that never happens, and Zollicoffer crosses. So that's kind of the scenario in December. In November 1861, it was determined by the War Department in Richmond. President Jefferson Davis, being a West Point graduate himself, wanted to see West Point trained officers, graduates of the military academy, to take high-ranking positions. And of course, there was no professionally trained military officer in charge in eastern Tennessee around Knoxville. At that time period, another brigadier commissioned by the state of Tennessee, William Carroll, is down in Knoxville. So it's determined that Brigadier General George Bibb Crittenden, a Kentuckian himself of the famed Crittenden family, son of John J. Crittenden, one of the last compromisers trying to avert civil war, and who has aligned himself with the Confederacy, George, that is. And they promote him to Major General, and they put him in charge of all the forces in eastern Tennessee, going all the way into Kentucky. And when he gets to Knoxville, he finds out that Zollicoffer has crossed the river and immediately orders Zollicoffer to recross. And, Zollicoffer tells him that, of course, he's going to do that, and he does not. Crittenden never follows up, and he will arrive at the beginning of January 1862 to Mill Springs to find that the majority of the Confederate forces are still on the north side of the Cumberland River. The river had swollen through heavy inundation of rain, and it's the contention of Zollicoffer and the officers that they can't recross. I would refute that now with hindsight. It's interesting because not only is Crittenden getting across with his staff constantly, and we'll get into the battle maybe later on or on another series of this podcast since we're approaching our time soon. But the reality is that even as the days just prior to the battle taking place, in fact, the day before, 2 full Confederate regiments, which had been occupying the south side of the river, cross in the morning of January 18th. 2 full regiments cross. So the river could not have been unfordable. It could not have been, they could not have extracted his force from the north side. I think that at that stage of the game, as things were starting to escalate, the U.S. forces that were coming to contest the crossing of the river and the establishment of Confederate entrenched position, they were on their way there. The intelligence was gathered, and that, well, we must do something about them. We can't. We must fortify this position, put all of our men in this position, and wait for them. So, the whole they couldn't cross, or the reports that Crittenden and Carroll and officers right after the fact, with their own hindsight of experiencing the battle and the events as they took place, I think is ridiculous, because they proved even in the days beforehand that they could make it across the swollen Cumberland River. It was not frozen. They did only have 1 boat, and they had some sizable rafts. They did it though. Evidence was right there that they could do it. The only thing that I would say to people we talk about this a lot, obviously. People ask us this question, why didn't they cross or recross? Or I read this. The other thing you can say is that the Cumberland River, the current runs away from the crossing at Mill Springs to the crossing on the north side at Beech Grove. And so was the river raging? Would it have been incredibly logistically difficult to get this army across? Well, I would say they didn't seem to have any trouble on the night of January 19th into the 20th when they were recrossing at that point to get out of Dodge. So again, we'll cover some of that stuff later on. But to get us to the point, the Confederates have a force across the river by the time of the battle, about 8 Confederate regiments, predominantly Tennesseans, 1 regiment of Alabamians, 1 regiment of Mississippians, several battalions of Confederate cavalry, a very large force in a very large and very comfortable winter encampment. And the majority of the soldiers there, if we were there at that time period, and we would be spending our time shooting squirrels and eating food and writing letters and doing everything but preparing for combat. We would be fat, high on the hog. The officers would be eating on fine china. Their servants would be giving them, innumerable things that they're receiving from across the river. And nobody really believed that they were going to be fighting any major battle in the wintertime. They really were setting themselves up to wait out the winter, and eventually the spring thaw would bring whatever campaign the generals planned. But it's evident by the letters that these soldiers were bombastic. It's still early war. They're still excited. I can, for every Yankee, for every Reb can kill 8 Yankees. They're still writing good stuff in their letters about that, just like the Federals are writing the same thing on the other side. And this is the good stuff about the early war, where you're really getting, they're not hardened veterans. They are green novice troops. And I would say to your listeners that if you start to look at the Battle of Mill Springs, look at the regiments engaged on the battlefield. They are hardened veterans of the Army of Tennessee at the battles of Shiloh, Murfreesboro, Chickamauga, Missionary Ridge, Atlanta, all the way to the end of the war in North Carolina. For them, these guys are cutting their teeth for the very first time, and it's going to be a learning experience for them for sure.
Yeah, I think this is the perfect place to pause. I mean, we've got everything set up perfectly. Next time we can jump into when they collide, which is coming.
Yep.
And we can talk about the decisions made that lead to that. So, I mean, this is great setup. Awesome. I love knowing where everybody's at and how these troops are feeling and thinking. This is just, like you said, that those early war guys are just, the shininess and the newness of everything is still there, and they haven't seen the bad stuff yet.
Nope.
And it's so interesting.
Yep.
So, Andrew, this has been great. Love talking about this stuff, especially 1861, 62 Kentucky. That is one of my prime interests, I would say. So, before we get off of here, Daryl, you got anything you want to add?
No, I concur. This is a good setup for our next 4 parts of Mill Springs. I love it. Love it.
Yep.
In all seriousness, I know we jest a little bit, but I the feedback that we've received about these multi-part ones have been really great, and so I think folks really do want the deeper dive. So however it works next time, this is fantastic.
We got through
3, 4, 5. We got through 5.
Yeah,
halfway.
Yeah,
halfway.
I'm sure we'll have a whole lot more we'll add in.
Absolutely.
So be on definitely listeners, be on the lookout for part 2 to our Mill Springs discussion here, and do what Andrew said. Look them up online on social media. Let your voice be heard. Let them let the Parks Department know all these good things that you're looking forward to at Mill Springs and all these other sites. So help them out with that, which is we would love to see these additions made to Mill Springs, these houses that he's been talking about, and all these other places that are outside of the other national parks that could potentially be added one day. So do that, help them out, and it's just one reason why this podcast exists, is so that we can let everybody know these things are going on. So so thank you all for listening tonight, and if you haven't, subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Give us a good rating. YouTube, we're on there too. Subscribe on YouTube and give us the thumbs up, and just tell other people about the podcast. Share it whenever you get it, and that way we can continue to grow people's knowledge here about the Western Theater and the Civil War. So with that, good night, everybody, and we are definitely looking forward to next time.
Thanks all.